Remember that time when Cold War was hitting absolute zero? Nelson Mandela got freed from jail, and the WHO was like, hey, maybe being gay isn't a disease. Today I'm talking about that one from 1990, Die Hard 2. First, Die Hard has to be one of the greatest 80s action movies. There's something so charming and almost low stakes about what happens in the movie that it helps me to fully invest in its goings on.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
Sure, there's a bunch of cheesy, over-the-top action indicative of the 80s, but by the time that crops up, you're already fully all in on these characters. And then there's Die Hard 2.
Son of a bitch.
I somehow got through all of my life to this point without having ever seen Die Hard 2. Until now, that is. And wow, it's awful. Die Hard 2's major plot points come from a book that has nothing to do with the original, and it shows. The stakes of the story are nowhere near as intimate as they are in the first movie, just by virtue of the setting. John is in an airport full of people, and it's Christmas time, so it's especially busy. We lose that tension that comes from John being completely alone in the first movie. Here, after a firefight, a slew of paramedics show up to tend to the wounded SWAT officers. For the audience, the stakes feel so much lower for John. If he steps in a bunch of glass in this movie, a bunch of paramedics can just fix him up.
Make you waste your time.
McClane has no real reason to be involved in the events of this movie at all.
Hey, man.
The conceit from the beginning is that he's the one who notices the bad guys setting their big plan into motion and just, I don't know, generally being nefarious. It's not super clear why he finds them suspicious, but he does, so movie happens. Okay, so now the script has manufactured a reason for John to be involved in what's happening, at least enough to get into our first shootout. But now what? There are police and security in this airport after all, so why does John continue as an active part of the narrative? The police chief in charge of the airport officers even mentions how great his team of SWAT officers are, how capable they are at handling the situation.
A sitting duck.
Oh darn. Well, now John can go out of his way to keep doing stuff, I guess.
What are you gonna do? Whatever I can.
I think 80s action movies were only ever as good as the villain. You had to get someone that could play menacing while still being kind of hammy and over the top. And this movie doesn't really do either of those things. I have very little idea of what the villains of this movie are doing or why. And yeah, that's right, I said villains, because this movie just decides that pretty much everyone John meets should be evil, either outwardly or secretly.
Gentlemen.
To evil.
There's no connection to any of the big bads for John. There's basically no reason for him to be as gung-ho about stopping this plan as he is in the movie. The movie takes the book's lead and puts the hero's loved one on one of the planes that may crash as a way to personalize the story for John, but it really just feels tacked on. If anything, John's actions through most of the movie pretty much guarantee that Holly's plane will crash.
What if they decide to crash another plane in retaliation for your little stunt?
So we have a character that has no reason to be involved with the events, and the few that are manufactured seem to be more likely to make him avoid getting involved. One of the very few things I do like about this movie is John's failure to land the plane with the torches. It's kind of a neat little aside, like John's the type of dude who wouldn't realize that a tiny torch isn't enough to direct an airliner to a dark runway. Like, he thinks these guys with the tiny lightsabers are what the pilots aim for at night. It also helps to set up the plan to leave the burning fuel line at the end of the movie, so I'll give that one some kudos.
Oh, man, I can't fucking believe this. Another basement, another elevator. How could the same shit happen to the same guy twice?
I feel like a bunch of executives sat down with creatives for this movie and said, okay, make it again. The creatives then had to ask themselves what made Die Hard so good? How do we capture that again? And they just came up with every wrong answer. Hans Gruber has got to be one of the best bad guys from this time period in the action genre. The way Alan Rickman sells him as calm and erudite, the script writes him as smart enough to plant the backstory of a revolutionary while really being an unscrupulous capitalist.
You're saying?
He's elitist and smug, but the audience still likes him because at least he's not this douche.
Business is business.
For this movie, the villain's complexity boils down to a man that does naked yoga, and although he's some sort of military savant, he doesn't like the US. Thrilling. We're shown he's smart because he pulls off the plan to hijack the airport, but that's basically all we see of his supposed prowess.
I get that a lot.
Point number 2 that our brain trust came up with is that John was essentially alone in Die Hard. Any help he had was outside of Nakatomi Plaza and was usually not even that helpful. Here's the problem though, in the sequel, we've decided that he's in an airport full of people at the busiest time of the year, fully accessible by other local law enforcement and or military. So they instead decide to make everyone that could be in a position of help either incompetent or just actually evil.
We wouldn't have to do this.
Look, I get this kind of happens in the first movie too. The FBI guys make everything tougher, sure. But in this movie, it's honestly every character in a position of power. No one trusts him, and the ones that do just turn out to also be with the villains.
What do you call that shit?
Some of the most fun of Die Hard was that the upper floors of the building were still under construction. So you could get John sneaking around using air ducts, secret passages, and traversing elevator shafts. This sequel tries so hard to regain this, they just invent a new wing of the airport so they can give the audience more scenes exactly like this. They even make John crawl through the air ducts for reasons. It's so obvious that they go out of their way attempting to recapture lightning in a bottle that in the scene where some of the glass shatters, I truly expected them to find a way to force him to walk through it barefoot.
The terrorists have cut all our systems.
The problem with this story is that from its inception, it's just wrong. Take a plot point from a completely irrelevant book, check. Attempt a compelling, intelligent villain, check. Make the protagonist the only one who can save the day, check. Have him outmatched and outgunned, check. Give him some crazy hurdles to jump to pursue the villains, check. You know on the internet when you see people theorizing about terrible ideas for an upcoming project or sequel? This movie feels like that. It feels like a bad fanfic by far less creative people. The movie just ties up all this creative diarrhea in a loose and lazy bow. It feels almost as though they had plotted out everything they want to happen in the movie, and then they rush to get all the pieces moving where they need to go. We start off bombarded with exposition, and since none of the stakes of the movie are personal to John, this is mostly done through talking head news clips. Look, I don't hate this trope like I'm sure others do. I think it can definitely be used effectively, especially when applied sparingly. But to launch this movie, there's just constantly a TV or radio personality explaining the forthcoming plot details to the audience. And really, there's no other effective way to join this information into the movie's narrative organically. What does a hero cop waiting for his wife to arrive have to do with some Central American war criminal? Nothing. Of course we need to force feed this connection.
Fine, done. I accept that.
By the 30-minute point in this movie, they've established no less than 8 plot threads. We have John in the airport, some shady goons doing something out of church, something being planned around air travel, Holly flying into DC, a Latin general being brought to the US, John's job and colleagues in LA, the reporter from Die Hard being on Holly's plane, and the reporter from DC being suspicious, I guess.
Excuse me.
Come on, give me a break.
I find myself wondering if this is deliberate on the part of the filmmakers, maybe trying to make the pace feel frantic and uneasy for the audience. After all, the defined timeline to destruction is one of the central points of the bad guy's plan. But it ends up so rushed and disorienting that, intentional or not, it's just bad. The scenes play out with no time to breathe. The audience can't sit in the revealed info and attempt to parcel out what's happening or might happen. It's a fire hose of information to the point that you don't really have a good idea what the point of the movie is until the 45-minute mark.
Okay.
And if it wasn't bad enough to blast the audience into submission, the movie goes so far out of its way attempting to recapture the story beats of Die Hard that we're inundated with meaningless, superfluous scenes. John ends up calling Powell in LA because everyone in DC is either incompetent or evil. The scenes with Holly and Thornburg are just odd, manufactured conflict in an already overstuffed movie.
Moron.
It's fan service. It's just there to be there and to make the audience go, hey, it's that guy from the first one. It serves no point in the actual narrative. When John eventually goes to the church to confront the bad guys, the filler ratchets up to 11. They toss in John getting into a fistfight with a random goon, but in the very next scene, the army backup arrives. Why did he try to get in alone? They immediately segue this into a snowmobile chase scene because it just wasn't an 80s or 90s action movie if there wasn't some sort of winter sports-themed chase and or shootout. Speaking of when the bad guys abandon the church, why does the airport act like they still can't land planes? Okay, so all of the tower's capabilities are in the church, granted, and the church is wired with C4, so they can't go there to get control back. Fine. But they already had another system to talk to the planes, and they could just, line a bunch of emergency vehicles with lights flashing to guide the planes along the runways. They literally just pretend there's nothing they can do and all the planes are just going to have to drop from the sky when they know for a fact that the bad guys are no longer in control of the tower.
Christ.
About halfway through the movie, we need to get the Latin general to free himself, so he's being guarded by one single soldier. The only people on the plane are their high-value war criminal, this goofy soldier and 2 pilots. And speaking of the villains, their motivations in this movie are so unclear it's comical. What I've gleaned from the torrent of exposition the movie jizzes all over us is that he worked with the American bad guys during Grenada, and they all really like each other. Either during that war or maybe afterwards this guy becomes a war criminal, and the US troops decide they want to free him, and they can all live happily together on a tropical island that won't extradite any one of them for their war crimes.
Life, my pride, my admiration, and a kick-ass vacation. Now get on board.
Seriously, that's their motivation. They want a honeymoon.
You don't get much of that in the tropics, Major.
For you gentlemen, we'll import it.
The absolute worst parts of this movie have to be the action scenes. Die Hard had this great slow build-up to the crazier action set pieces like jumping off of roofs or hiding under a conference table from machine gun fire. This movie just starts balls to the wall, and damn, it was super nice of the villainous terrorists to use plot-timed grenades to attempt to kill their one impediment to accomplishing their goals. Seriously, look how long they toss grenades into this cockpit. It just keeps going like a skit about a bad action movie. And then in the final fight on the wing of the escape plane, John tries a flying elbow on the army guy. Where did he jump from? How did the guy not see him when he got on the wing? What's happening in this movie?
Son of a bitch!
Okay, am I crazy, or did they just put a Wicked Witch chime into this scene? Holly has to have the absolute best reaction of any person on film to this.
Do we have enough fuel to keep circling like this?
Oh, of course. They anticipate little problems like this.